My guest is Chris Leithner. I've asked Chris into the studio tonight because he flicked me an email and was the very latest of the what's called the Government Accountability Office on the state of the United States bottom line, if you like. And it's quite shocking when you read it. Chris Leithner, welcome back.
Thank you, Steve.
Just explain who the United States Government Accountability Office is. Who are they?
They are basically the accountants for the US government. In cooperation with the US Treasury, they put together the accounts as best they can. We'll talk about that in a second. And also, from time to time, typically once a year, but sometimes also more frequently than once a year, they put together what they call the long-term fiscal outlook for the government. They basically
terrible name, but it's the next how things look money-wise for the next 12 months.
Well, given the laws as they stand and what the President has said to the Congress pass these laws, given the obligations to do with things like Social Security, Medicare and the like, they extrapolate them forward and they say, well, here are the implications for the fiscal health or otherwise of the government for the next typically 10 or 20 years.
So they're a bit like sort of a much bigger standard, a bit like the Queensland Auditor General, if you like, something like that?
In a sense, although it's interesting when you use the phrase audit, because roughly 10 years or so ago in one of the reports, they basically threw up their hands and said, look, we've gone through, to the extent we can, the 20 biggest entities within the US government, and a dozen of them, 12 out of 20, are simply unauditable. If you can visualize, as with, I suppose, some people would do with their tax returns, you throw the receipts into a shoebox and simply throw it into an accountant's lap. There were what they called unauditable trails. Something like $1.1 trillion for the Pentagon alone. So the phrase, there's no accounting for government, is quite literally true. In a fundamental sense, the most recent auditor, Comptroller General, as he's called, basically resigned in despair, saying this entity is simply unauditable. It's a monster which is so totally and utterly out of control. It violates the laws of accounting so egregiously that I no longer associate myself with it.
This is the federal government of the United States, and it's unauditable, according to their own audit office.
According to the previous occupant of the post, called the Comptroller General, who's gone on the road and basically said that debt is exploding, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the gist of it.
All right. Now, we know that the budget deficit of the United States is at about nearly 10% of everything they produced last year.
That's right.
It's the largest amount of debt since World War II. Now, everyone's been saying, no big deal, although they were warned that they would be in a position of unsustainable growth in debt. But the Government Accountability Office has actually, in a sense, with this new report, highlighted something more, that essentially says that 93% of all its tax revenue will be taken up in just paying Social Security, health benefits and other government services.
And the interest on the debt.
And the interest on the debt.
That's exactly right.
Now just tell me the story, just step by step, what this means, because I've never heard this anywhere before.
Yes. Given...
It's not been reported yet, as far as I know.
That's correct. And as far as I know, it hasn't been reported either. Given the obligations set in stone by the Congress to pay Social Security pensions and so on, given the obligations regarding, say, pharmaceutical benefits, given the interest on the debt is exploding and therefore the interest is rising. Basically, those expenditures are going to crowd out everything else, such as so-called national defense, so-called education, Homeland Security, you name it. Either a couple of things have to happen, either drastic increases of taxation to create the revenue to pay for these other things, or the Congress has to say, in effect, well, gee, we've fibbed to pensioners, we're going to have to cut your pension, or we've fibbed to the recipients of pharmaceutical benefits, we're going to have to reduce the benefits you receive, or by stealth or otherwise, we're going to default on our debt because the obligations have become too high. It's either that or B, scrap the aircraft carriers, no more harassing of little old ladies in airport and so on, no more tasering of people around the country and whatnot.
All right, Chris Leithner, except that the world's big credit agencies like Moody's, Standard & Poor's, they rate the United States government when they issue bonds at AAA. They're really healthy.
The highest
They're
possible
very strong,
rating.
highest possible. The world's rating agencies say, well, doesn't matter because they can pay it back. They're worth it. They can pay it.
they are beginning slowly to hedge their bets. As early as 2005, so it's now 5 years ago, both Standard & Poor's and Moody's issued reports saying, in effect, the current patterns of expenditure are such that the world's major governments, and by memory it was definitely the United States, definitely the UK, France, Germany and Japan, and a few others tossed in, those ratings will recede to junk levels unless drastic changes occur. Now remember, that was 2005, so it's pre-global financial crisis, it's pre the additional bailout expenditures, explosion of debt, etc., etc. So what you're saying is quite right in the sense that as we speak, the US government is rated AAA, but slowly but surely, Moody's and Standard & Poor's are setting in train the various steps they need eventually to lead to a downgrade, and those steps are even more apparent when it comes to the UK. So there's a queue. So what we see in Greece at the moment, that's the first cab off the rank, then eventually, my guess, and it's a wild guess, come countries like Portugal and Spain and Italy and the UK, countries which are too big to bail out, by the way, and eventually comes the US.
So the Government Accountability Office warns their own houses of the people, their Congress and the Senate, that guys, 93% of all they take in tax dollars, 93% of it's going in Social Security, health, Medicaid, and costs on their national debt before they've even paid for their military, their education, Homeland Security. That should mean that technically they're broke.
Well,
but they're not. Clearly,
in any
people are still government buying and selling their bonds.
That's precisely right. In any private sector sense, not only are they broke, but they're trading whilst insolvent, and therefore jail terms and so on. The critical point, you can't repeat it, I'll try not to repeat it too much, but the standards which apply to individuals simply don't apply to government. If you and I do it, it's called theft. If the government does it, it's called taxation or fiscal policy. We have euphemisms. If you and I do it, it's called counterfeiting. We rightly go to jail. Central banks call it monetary policy. If you and I do it, it's called genocide. When the US and Britain and other countries do it, it's called foreign policy. In other words, we have this bizarre notion whereby we attach very high standards to, and quite properly so, to our own personal behavior, but governments are totally and utterly exempt from those sorts of standards. The implications, again, this is my guess, is that there comes a point when the pensioner in the United States, who remember is a voter, and pensioners in the US have a strong incentive to vote for obvious reasons, is going to be given a choice. A candidate will stand up as a campaign slogan and say, "No, we can't," will be the campaign slogan if that resonates for a particular incumbent president. That president will say, you have a choice, Ms. Pensioner. You can either keep your pension as it exists, or you can junk the U.S. empire, but you can't have both. So in other words, either the military expenditure goes by the board, the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, Homeland, all these other sorts of things have to be drastically pruned or junked in their entirety, or we're going to can your pension. You choose. And it seems to me at a certain stage, according to the GAO, within the next decade, that choice is going to be forced upon people.
So within the next decade, the ratings agencies or the effects of the Government Accountability Office's report saying, guys, you've got to make a choice. Mm-hmm. You either have pensions or you have a military. I mean, that's a globe-changing scenario, Chris.
Indeed, that for the better part of 100 years, governments have hidden two things from their subjects. They've hidden the cost of war, and they've hidden the cost of welfare. They've tried to inflate these things away to push the tin a bit further down the track. Yes, there are growing problems. You talked about the biggest deficit since the Second World War, et cetera, but that's for the next Congress or the next Prime Minister or the next incumbent or somebody in a couple of years' time, morgen, whatever the word is. And at a certain stage, though, tomorrow arrives, and at some stage, the borrowers around the world will simply say, gee, these governments have got too fat. They're in no position to repay the debts. Only a crazy person is going to lend to them. And whatever bond markets are, they're not permanently crazy. Does it come to a halt? I don't know if it comes to a halt, but one initial symptom will be an upward spike of interest rates as those lenders demand a much higher reward to compensate them for the risk of lending to governments.